Good morning, sir. Can you see and hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you very much.
And we can see and hear you. Thank you.
Good.
Can I call Keith Todd, please?
Yes.
If you repeat after me, I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Todd, can you give us your full name, please?
Yeah, Thomas Keith Todd.
Now, sir, Mr. Todd explained to me before he gave evidence that he would like, with your permission, to remove his jacket. Is that acceptable to you?
Of course it is.
Thank you very much. Yes, please
Thank you,
do, Mr.
Chairman.
Mr. Todd, as you know, my name is Jason Beer and I ask questions on behalf of the inquiry. Thank you very much for coming to give evidence today, and thank you for providing a witness statement to the inquiry previously. We're very grateful. You should have in front of you a hard copy of that witness statement in your name and dated the 6th of September 2022. If you turn to the last page of that statement, which I think is page 60, can you see your signature?
Not on the copy on my desk. But
Have a look at the copy behind you in volume 1 and turn up tab A1 and go to page 60 in there.
yes,
That is your signature.
that is my signature.
And are the contents of that statement true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes, they are.
Thank you very much. Just for the purposes of the transcript, no need to display now. The URN for the witness statement is WITN 03880100. Can I start, please, Mr. Todd, with your career qualifications and experience? I think you were formerly Chief Executive Officer, CEO, of International Computers Limited, ICL.
Correct, yes.
And relevantly, for our purposes, you were also a director of ICL Pathway Limited.
That's correct.
By way of overview, I think you joined ICL in July 1987, is that right?
That's correct.
Initially as the finance director.
That's correct.
You became the CEO of ICL in January 1996.
Correct.
On the 1st of January 1996, I think.
Indeed.
Now, you resigned from all positions in ICL and related companies in July 2000, is that right?
That's correct.
On the 28th of July 2000, I think. By way of background, I think you began your working life in 1972 as an executive officer in the Royal Ordnance Factories, is that right?
That's correct.
And thinking back, that was then a state-owned weapons manufacturer, is that right?
That's correct. Making chieftain tanks.
You
amongst other
complete.
things.
Sorry, say again.
Amongst other things.
Yes. You completed accountancy training whilst there, I think.
Correct.
So as a civil servant, and you qualified as a fellow of the Chartered Institute of Management Accountants.
Correct.
You worked between 1975 and 1987 for Marconi's and a subsidiary of it here and in the United States.
That's correct. In the defence industry.
Again, weapons manufacturer.
Yes.
And you took up, as we've said, your role as FD at ICL in 1987.
That's correct.
And I think in your time before taking up that position, and indeed before the events that we're going to speak about today, you plainly had no hands-on experience with post offices, other than perhaps going in and buying a stamp.
Merely as a customer, as it is today.
As our first ICL witness, I'm going to ask you a series of relatively basic questions, if I may, about the corporate structure of the relevant entities involved and their development across time. Do you understand?
That's fine.
ICL, is this right, was established in 1968
That's correct.
as, or supposedly as, the UK's answer to the US giant IBM. Is that right?
That's right. It was bringing together a number of the UK's technology assets at that date.
It was part of a push by Tony Benn, I think, under the Wilson government to create a...
That is correct. A technology competitor to the global technology players.
Thank you. In 1990, Fujitsu acquired 80% of ICL shares from its parent company, STC plc.
Correct.
STC, Standard Telephones and Cables. And I think paid about 1.29 billion US dollars, 740 million pounds.
I recognise that more clearly, yes. Thank you.
In 1998, Fujitsu became ICL's sole shareholder, is that right?
As best as I recall, that was about the date.
And then in 2002, the ICL brand was dropped by Fujitsu.
I couldn't particularly address that. I was aware when I left that there was an appetite to create one Fujitsu. So that date doesn't surprise me.
Okay, thank you. ICL Pathway Limited, when was that created and for what purpose? Can you help us?
Yes, so the Pathway company was created when we were looking at bidding for the project to build a new infrastructure for the post office, which we're going to be talking a lot about during the next few hours. And it was our view that forming a dedicated company, sometimes known as a special purpose vehicle, would be a benefit to our proposition that we were going to put forward in response to the request for proposals that were coming out. The idea behind it was, and this may come up in your subsequent questioning, that Pathway, when it was originally formed, had a number of shareholders. It also had an independent chairperson, Sir Michael Butler, an ex-prominent civil servant, and we felt that by having a special purpose vehicle that would be fully supported by ICL and Fujitsu, that we would be able to focus the energies and efforts not just on the project but the subsequent success of that business.
So it was a special purpose vehicle, a company comprising other companies or contributions from other companies.
Yes, and if I may just add one thing,
Yes.
because when people say special purpose vehicles, they may default and think Bahamas, or this was, a UK company.
And initially, at least, the main companies that it comprised of were ICL, Gyrobank, Anpost, and De La Rue. Is that right?
That's correct.
One of those companies, Anpost, the Irish Post Office, they, I think, were, you say in your statement, already using software that you were to propose as part of the project. Is that right?
That's correct.
Which software was that?
Software that came from a company called Escher. As I recall, I think the product name may be Riposte.
Yes.
And that we had, as I recall, heard about the software and the success that had occurred with the Irish Post Office, as a result of which we took on board a relationship with Escher as an important subcontractor on this project. And Anpost's experience of dealing with the post office we felt would be very valuable to us as we navigated the proposal stage, but also potentially subsequently through the implementation phase.
And so it was a part of the software that you were subsequently to use as part of your proposition to the Benefits Agency and Post Office Counters
Yes,
Limited.
it was part of the core part of the post office element and the counterpart of that. And it had given us, the fact that it had been deployed, sort of some confidence in the technologies.
What did you know about what other technology had been deployed alongside it in the Republic of Ireland?
I don't recall any specific knowledge.
So you didn't know the system of which it was a part, to your recollection?
To my recollection, I didn't know the specific detail.
Can I turn to your role in Pathway overall, please? In your witness statement, that's, and I'll ask for this to be displayed on the screen, that's WITN 0338 0100. And then if we, no, that's not right. WITN 0388 0100. Thank you. And page 5, please. And then if we can highlight paragraph 20, please. You say, as part of this renewed focus on systems and software, from early 1995, I oversaw ICL's bid for the Benefits Agency / Post Office Counters Limited contract to computerise the payments of benefits in the UK. I undertook this role initially as Chief Financial Officer and then as Chief Executive Officer from January 1996.
Yeah, that's correct.
So what did overseeing mean in your role as Chief Financial Officer from early 95 until January 96?
The CEO I worked with until I became CEO was Sir Peter Bonfield. And I initially, as I think you may have articulated, joined the company as CFO, but took on responsibility for business strategy as well in a number of years up until I became CEO. During that period, we were involved as a founder member of the Camelot Consortium, and I was a founder director of Camelot that, as I'm sure people listening to this will know, won the right to run the UK lottery, and for a number of years extremely successfully. So I had experience from specifically prior to the bid for the post office on overseeing major contracts. And if I may just for a moment take a reference back to my days in the defence industry. The defence industry was and is involved in very significant technology projects of all natures, from communications to weapons to satellites. So my experiences from those days had been useful to ICL as the transition of the company from a product company, which I drove more aggressively from 1996, was occurring. So the oversight, to go back specifically to your question, was that, as I recall, Peter Bonfield asked me to take oversight on the strategy, the formation of the team, the consortium, working with, at the time, Mr. Bennett.
So what does, in practice, oversight mean at this stage? So early 95 until January 96?
Aware of, get reports on the RF, request for proposal status, discussion around the potential makeup of the participants of our bid, as well as review both as oversight and as CFO of ICL of the financial proposals.
Did oversight mean lead?
the central focal point in a large organisation, ICEL was broadly a 3 billion sterling company. This project was a very important project, no denying on that, because it was very supportive of our new strategy, but it was only one of a number of things which I was involved in and had oversight on. We had put in place, as I mentioned before, a team, as I recall, with John Bennett, certainly, and the reports that he provided monthly, I'm sure we'll talk about shortly. So a team to run the project day to day. So I was not involved every day on the project, but certainly from a oversight point of view, had significant involvement.
Thank you. We'll come to the more particular arrangements as to the structure of the team, excuse me, in a moment. Before we do that, can we establish the broad chronology of events, and can we use your helpful document to do this? It's Witness 0388 0101. Thank you. And just to be clear, this is an exhibit to your witness statement that you compiled yourself.
That's correct.
And you say at the top under the rubric, I have exhibited below a timeline of key dates and events that I refer to in this statement, taken from my review of the materials provided to me by the inquiry. This covers the history of ICL and ICL's involvement in the procurement process and subsequent contract with POCL and the DSS.
That's correct. And my post-submission review, I noted a couple of things which, with hindsight, I would have added, which I'm sure will come up. Peter Copping's time period of his review, Montague's involvement, and the Corbett.
The Corbett review too.
Corbett review, which, on reflection of the timeline, maybe should have been included.
Just picking this document up then to get a broad overview to start with. In the fourth line, in May 1994, I think Peter Lilly was then the Secretary of State for Social Security. Yes?
Correct.
And he announced an intention to automate the benefits payment system. Is that right?
That's correct.
And can you recall, was that an announcement about benefits payment rather than automation of the post office?
I don't recall specifically, but the focus and of his responsibilities was the DSS.
Yes. In any event, in August 1994, next line, the DSS published its invitation notice. Is that right?
That's correct. And you kindly said it before, we are referring to events that happened up to 27 years ago.
Yes.
So I hope everybody listening to this will understand I do not have perfect recall of these dates. These were dates facilitated by some documents that were shared.
Thank you. And if there are any particular points in your evidence you wish to emphasise that point again, then please do say so,
Yeah.
that you're going from what you've read, not
Yeah.
what you remember.
Yeah.
In any event, in August 94, publication of an invitation notice. So that's a notice to potential bidders to ask them to express an interest in the contract if they wish to do so.
That's correct.
Yes? And again, I think, as the chronology shows, this was a DSS lead. They were leading on this.
I don't specifically recall at what point it became the joint lead, but yeah.
And as you, I think, explain in your witness statement to us, no need to turn it up, the word 92 expressions of interest at this stage?
Yes, and again, that's from research and documents provided. I would have naturally recalled it was very competitive. I would have naturally recalled, and you may be about to get to this, that the final shortlist was down to 3, of which, in my recollection, IBM was the #1 competitor.
Before we get to that, there was a stopping off point in December 94, next line. That group of 92 had been whittled down to a short list of 5, one of which was Pathway.
Correct.
By the January 95, as you've just told us, ICL was formally incorporated, is that right?
I see a Pathway.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then, as the chronology shows, if we skip on a line or two, in April 1995, a statement of service requirements was issued to shortlisted suppliers. By this time, had the number of bidders been whittled down to 5?
I don't recall
Okay.
the precise timing.
What do you understand the purpose of a statement of service requirements to be?
A statement from the customer of what the technology is required to be able to deliver, and it was a very broad base covering both as I recall, the post office infrastructure renewal, which we'll expand on, I'm sure, in a moment, and the transformation of the way benefits would be paid to UK citizens.
So would a short, pithy description, would you agree with this, of a statement of service requirements be a description of the functional requirements which the sponsor or sponsors expected the project to deliver?
Yes, I think that's fair.
By July 1995, had something called the Evaluation Board narrowed down the bidders to 3, ICL, Pathway, IBM and CardLink.
Yes, I wouldn't have naturally remembered CardLink, but when I saw it on documentation, it sort of came back. I certainly remember IBM as being our thinking. My recollection, I couldn't remember the name CardLink, was that the other bidder was too inexperienced in the complex world of delivering complex technology projects.
By February 1996, if we move on, is it right that invitations to tender were issued to those 3 remaining bidders?
Again, from the documentations, the date is, I confirm the date.
Yes.
But, yes, I would recall that we were asked to respond with the other 2.
And then the next month, those bids were received in March 1996, but is it right that they all came in over the level of price acceptable to the sponsors? So the bidders were requested to retender.
So we were definitely requested to retender. Have to repeat again that this is a long time ago, precisely the reasons for the retender. It's not unusual for that to occur, but I wouldn't have recalled from memory that it was because they all exceeded, quote, the price. We may well come on to this later on, the evaluation and why we won, but the word price is a specific word. Another set of words that apply is, value for money, and as we'll no doubt get to, risk transfer.
In April of that year, on the 22nd of April, your chronology shows that ICL Pathway's revised bid was submitted. And on the 15th of May, is this right, ICL Pathway Limited was awarded the contract?
Yes, that is correct. And there's a point that may or may not come up with your questioning. There was absolutely a surprise, I think, for all the bidders through this process, that when the first tender came out, the extensiveness of it, the number in my mind is 2,000 pages. It was, much more significant than had originally been discussed when it eventually arrived. So there was, it was a very significant document that all the parties responded to.
So a detailed invitation to tender.
It was much more detailed than had been indicated previously.
Did that cause a problem?
Time to evaluate all of the clauses and sub-clauses. Certainly caused a significant amount of additional work.
Did it affect the quality of the bid that you put in? Was that the implication from saying that the ITT
No,
was
I wouldn't draw
long?
that conclusion. I'm just going to sort of summarise and say that there was a great deal more work that the ICL Pathway team and its competitors and our subcontractors had to do at the time to get on top of it. At the time we bid, we were comfortable with our bid and that our ability to deliver, albeit, and I'm sure we'll get to this, it was always a very tight timescale.
And in terms of timescale, is it right that at this stage your bid had two significant milestones in it? And we get this from paragraph 34 of your witness statement. No need to turn it up. I'll just summarise it. Firstly, the operational trial of Pathway would be completed by June 97. And then secondly, a full rollout to all 19,000 post offices would be completed by end of 1999.
That sounds correct.
Thank you. Now, you've mentioned today your previous work history in the defence industry and how that assisted you in this context. You've told us about how the Camelot lottery system was designed, implemented, rolled out. It's right, isn't it, I think, additionally to that chronology, that at the same time that ICL was bidding and tendering to the DSS and the Post Office for what became the Horizon contract, it was also in litigation with the DSS. Do you remember that?
I saw reference to that in the documents, but would not have recalled that.
I wonder whether we could just look at the documents to see whether that assists, and indeed it's to do with a system called Assist in capital letters.
Yeah.
Do you remember that system?
I remember the project named Assist, yeah.
That was, I think, a contract between ICL and the DSS, yes?
Yes, I would probably recall that. I certainly recall the project Assist.
And I think we can see from the documents it was for ICL to build and then operate a statistical analysis system for the DSS.
I wouldn't have recalled that.
Okay. I wonder whether we can look, please, at DWP 400375. Now, just to see what this is to start with, you'll see that it's a memo circulated within the Benefits Agency and Post Office Counters Limited. And it's the subject of it is the visit of Mr. Yakamoto, the chairman of Fujitsu, to the Secretary of State.
Yeah, there is actually a spelling there. It was Yamamoto, but that's on the document as you read it.
Yes. And I think we'll find in due course that Mr. Yamamoto visited the Secretary of State in December 1996.
Correct.
And I think, as we'll find out in due course, you were present at that meeting between the Secretary of State and the Chairman of Fujitsu.
Correct.
Now,
Again, reminded from the document that I
Yes.
think I may have only received
recently,
very recently.
can we look, please, at page 7 of this document, please? Now, this is part of a series. This is not something that you would have seen at the time, because this is an internal communication within Benefits Agency and Post Office counters in preparation for a Secretary of State meeting with the Chairman of Fujitsu. And you'll see that from the document as a whole, that it raises a series of issues, the kind of things that a Secretary of State might be asked about. It briefs him on them and then sets out some lines to take. Do you see that?
Yes.
And it's just the passage at the top of the page that I'm interested in. So if we just read the first few bullet points under the heading Assist, the DSS has an ongoing contractual disagreement with ICL in relation to a contract awarded in January 1993 to ICL to build and operate a statistical analysis system called Assist. The contract for Assist, in consortium with Hoskins, was terminated on the 19th of October 1994, and the DSS issued a writ alleging misrepresentation and breach of contract on the 19th of May 1995. ICL served its defence and counterclaim in December 1995. Preliminary hearings have taken place in the High Court, mainly on procedural issues. Hearings on the main issues are not scheduled to begin until April 1998 and may run until the year 2000. Can you recall this now, that the DSS had terminated their contract with ICL and issued proceedings against your company for misrepresentation and breach of contract?
I up until seeing this document recently, had no recollection of that legal action.
This document tells us that the contract was terminated in October 1994.
Yeah.
So just orientating ourselves in our pathway chronology, that's at the time that ICL was bidding for the contract with the DSS and with Post Office Counters Limited, isn't it?
That's correct. And just for the avoidance of doubt, I am not saying I wouldn't have known about it, but I had, I would not, had I not seen that document, had any recollection of the that specific contractual dispute.
No. You would have known about it at the time, because a government suing a contractor for an alleging misrepresentation,
and we may
quite,
get
quite a big thing, isn't it?
Yeah, we may get into this a little bit later on. I mean, it's, for any party to sue, it is, it should not be taken lightly, but it is always the right of the parties to do that if resolution of issues cannot be achieved through discussion and cooperation.
And we'll see the sinews that were stretched and strained in the ICL pathway contract, not to go down the litigation route in due
That
course.
is precisely why I'm mentioning that context. And again, let me call this an opinion, but one maybe many will relate to. There are different approaches in different national jurisdictions. The US tends to be more naturally litigious, would be my opinion. Europe is less so, but the accepted practice of appropriate law is the right protection if parties can't agree. My opinion would be the Japanese culture is even less orientated to take legal action.
And so just in terms of...
But that is an opinion.
Okay. Just in terms of the chronology, though, the government terminated its contract with ICL at precisely the same time that ICL Pathway was bidding with the very same contract supplier, DSS, and also the Post Office.
ICL had a very substantial business based on history on its mainframe computing, a word from the past, but mainframe computing, then mid-range computing, and then PCs. I don't recall the names of the various projects, but I think you would find that we had a whole range of relationships. And again, we may get to this, but these were factors which were known at the time.
What do you mean by that? These were factors that were known at the time?
Well, as you've just pointed out to me, or the document pointed out to me, these factors were known when the evaluation of the proposal was undertaken.
And just in terms of the chronology, the proceedings were issued according to this document in May 1995, and in terms of our pathway chronology, that's a couple of months before ICL became one of the three selected bidders for the contract with the DSS and Post Office Counters Limited.
That's correct.
Can you recall, was any of this seen as an impediment by ICL to your bid, namely that you were in litigation over an IT contract with the very government department that you were seeking to negotiate another IT contract with?
I have no recollection of that being discussed. It may well have been, but I would like to just also remind, for context purposes, where we are in 1995. The internet started actually many years earlier, but the emergence of the new world really was around this period. And I will keep this succinct, but if you look at some of the names of the households today, in 1994, they don't even exist in Amazon, Facebook, and these places. So we had a period through that we're talking about, and this is relevant for a wider context of the question, where ICL was changing and working to adapt to the new world of the consumer-centric. We were engaged with the government across the board, and it's various documents that have been presented to me in the last few days and months sort of reinforce this. So the ICL relationship with the UK government and many of the departments was very broad, very constructive, very engaged at trying to really help the UK governmental public sector institutions move forward with what was transformational technologies at the time.
This ICL pathway contract was later described as the largest non-military IT contract in Europe. Do you remember that?
I remember it being the largest one we had won at the time.
To your knowledge, did the DSS and Post Office Counters Limited bring into account in evaluating your bid that one of them, the DSS, had terminated an IT contract with ICL and alleged misrepresentation against it?
I have no knowledge or recollection of that.
You got no recollection of any discussions about the effect of an outstanding...
No, my recollections are that we were very concerned that IBM, a very credible competitor of scale in global technology, might succeed in beating us in the competition.
You say in your witness statement, we needn't turn them up now, but examples could be found at paragraph 17, 42, 50 and 175, that ICL had a proven track record on delivering large national IT projects, yes?
That's correct.
Would it be fair to describe this issue, the assist contract, as a recent and relevant example where the DSS had taken the opposite view, that your track record was not a good one?
I think you will would probably find there are very specific disputed details about that specific contract. But I am afraid I can't help this inquiry with any details of exactly what that dispute was about.
Could I turn to a separate issue then, please? In the that can be taken down. Thank you. In the chronology, and that's what ICL was saying at this stage about fraud prevention and detection. And I wonder whether we could turn up, please, paragraph 25 of your witness statement. And that's witness 0388 0100. To page 7, please. And at the top of the page, you say, it was my understanding that the aims of the Horizon project were as follows, and you set out 3, fraud prevention, post office modernisation, and infrastructure. Sorry, if we can just go back to 24 at the top. Fraud prevention, post office modernisation, and infrastructure transformation. And then you say, I will deal with each in turn. And then in paragraph 25, you deal with the first of those, fraud prevention. And in there, in paragraph 25, is this right? You set out the aims of the government in relation to fraud prevention, and you describe how ICL already had experience in this area, including with the DSS, but not with the post office.
Yes, correct. ICL had an extensive business in retailing, point of sale. At the time, Marks and Spencer's, Sainsbury's, as I recall, were customers. Euromarché, Albertsons in the US. We had a number of post office banking customers, so we were very familiar with issues around fraud protection. All of the fraud protection discussions that I recall were focused on DSS. I do not recall any related to the post office.
We'll have a look at that at some documents in a moment. Yeah. Can you remember now that the fraud prevention risk that you describe in paragraph 25 under the joint contract that was agreed with DSS and Post Office Counters Limited was transferred from the sponsors to ICL?
Yeah, I don't recall the specific wording and within the contract on the transfer, but in essence, yes, risk transfer did take place between the customer parties and the company.
And just for those that are not as familiar as we are with what that means, in layman's terms, what does transferring the risk from the clients to the suppliers mean?
That's all in context. Again, I'm sure this will come up. This was, as I recall it, one of relatively early PFIs, private finance initiatives, where the public sector were looking at enabling the supply side to take accountability for the service delivery and provide the capital to finance the project, and therefore take the risk transfer of the success of the quantity of service delivery or other aspects of the project would move from the customer to the supplier.
Can we look, please, at what ICL was saying at a relatively early stage in relation to this? This is ICL's statement of capability of the 19th of November 1994. So this is part of the initial response to the invitation for bids. And it's Fujitsu, that's FUJ 309 8230. So I think we saw from the bottom of the page the date, 19th of November 1994. And so this is a part of the statement of capability of that date. So it's part of ICL's initial invitation, response to the initial invitation to bids.
Okay.
And can we go to page 8 of this document, please? And can we go to the paragraph second from the bottom? I should read the paragraph above it for context. It says ICL excuse me, has widespread experience in the security associated with payment systems in the retail sector, both in the UK and abroad. ICL also has undertaken systems and service development in anti-fraud projects within the UK DSS and within the UK local government authorities. And then the current approach includes the introduction of positive authentication, full reconciliation, and then and the provision of a full audit trail, including the ability to manage the statutory declaration documents. The suggestion that the system includes the provision of a full audit trail, what did you understand that to mean? Or what would you understand that to mean?
Well, I don't recall seeing these words specifically previously. I do acknowledge they are in the document which we fully submitted. I would read them to mean what it says literally.
What do you, as the CEO, read them literally to mean, a full audit trail?
That there would be a record of the transactions that had been undertaken in the system.
So a record of the transactions that had been undertaken in the system available to who?
To the parties that were using the system.
I.e. to, at this stage, DSS and Post Office Counters Limited?
Yes.
At this stage, there isn't any suggestion that there would be a charge levied by ICL for the provision of that audit trail?
I have no recollection of any conversations about such matters. I don't recall any conversations specifically about audit trails.
To broaden it out, would this be right? You have no memory of any discussion at any time that if the customers, at this time DSS and Post Office Counters Limited, wanted to see the full audit trail, they would be charged for doing so, i.e. they would have to pay a sum of money to do so?
I have no recollection of any conversation about around that question.
Can we look forwards, please, to the agreement that was subsequently signed? Because, of course, this is at a time when there was a tripartite agreement between you, I call it you, your company, and Post Office Counters and the DSS. Can we look forward to the bilateral agreement that was subsequently signed with just ICL and Post Office Counters Limited? And it's Fujitsu 400071. So you can see the counterparties to that agreement. Yes?
Yes, yes.
And then I wonder whether we can look, please, at page 97 of this document. And that's it, thank you. And I'd like to read under the cross-heading prosecution support. And the contractor, that's defined elsewhere to mean ICL Pathway Limited. So ICL Pathway shall ensure that all relevant information provided by the Post Office Counters Limited service infrastructure at the request of Post Office Counters Limited shall be evidentially admissible and capable of certification in accordance with the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, PACE 1984, and the Police and Criminal Evidence Northern Ireland Order and equivalent 1989 and equivalent legislation covering Scotland. And then 4.1.9, at the direction of Post Office Counters Limited, audit trail and other information necessary to support live investigations and prosecutions shall be retained for the duration of the investigation and prosecution, irrespective of the normal retention period of that information. Just reading those words, i.e. The contractual obligations placed on ICL there, would you agree that in order for Pathway to comply with these provisions, it would be necessary for Pathway, ICL Pathway, to understand what, quote, the requirements of the law in relation to criminal proceedings are?
We would have had this contract reviewed not just by our internal legal team, but my recollection would be probably by an external team. I would therefore think it's reasonable to assume that we had an understanding of what that meant. I have no specific recollection of that clause or any discussion about that clause.
And presumably you give that answer because only if it knew what the requirements of the criminal law were, could it ensure, ICL could it ensure, that data was captured, was retained, that it enjoyed sufficient evidential integrity and reliability, and could be produced to a court. So only if you knew what the requirements of the law were could you do those four things: capture, retention, ensure reliability and integrity.
That seems to me to be a reasonable conclusion, yes.
And to your own knowledge, did ICL Pathway seek any advice on what the requirements of the criminal law were in order to be able to achieve
I don't recall
compliance with these
any
contractual... Hold on a moment.
Sorry.
That's all right.
Apologies.
So the question is, to your knowledge, did ICL Pathway seek any advice on what the requirements of the criminal law were in order to be able to achieve compliance with these contractual obligations?
I have no recollection of any conversation about the matter.
And to your knowledge, did ICL Pathway ever ask Post Office Counters Limited what it understood the requirements of the criminal law to be, to seek guidance from it as to how these two contractual provisions were to be fulfilled by ICL Pathway in practice?
I've got no recollection of any conversation with the Post Office about this matter.
Would you agree, standing back, that those are necessary things to do, getting some advice on what the criminal law requires and or speaking to the customer as to its understanding of what the criminal law requires in order that these provisions could be complied with in practice?
Yes.
Thank you. Can I move on, please? The award of the contract to ICL Pathway and what you described as the unaligned objectives of the Benefits Agency and Post Office Counters Limited. Can we look, please, at paragraph 39 of your witness statement? That's witness 0388 0100 at page 11. you tell us in paragraph 39 that an additional challenge in the procurement process was the fact that we were tendering for a contract that had two distinct clients, and then we had initially thought that the requirements of POCL, Post Office Counters Limited, and the DSS were aligned. However, after the award of the contract, it became clear that the two clients had separate and distinct management ethos, business objectives, and priorities. Yes?
Yes.
At what stage after the award of the contract did it become apparent that the clients had distinct management ethoses, business objectives, and priorities?
I don't recall a specific date, but that what I was referring to there was, and from recollection, the challenges, and these are multifaceted. First of all, and I'll come back directly to your question about the fact that this was a PFI contract, not a design build. The DSS culture, from my recollection, was one of classic government civil service procurement, structured, precise, with limited to no commercial flexibility. And the post office was emerging with a vision of it becoming a self-sustained, vibrant business. What I recall, and unfortunately I can't pin it down to specific activities, but it did become clear during that period that there had been a long-term frustration from the DSS that it continued to have to use the post office for the delivery of benefits. So what appeared to be an alignment on a procurement, we experience dysfunctionality between the two. And as I say in my statement, since that time, I have never signed a contract with two customers, one contract with two customers.
Can I just ask you to focus on the words? We initially thought that the requirements of the pair of them were aligned. However, after the award of the contract, it became clear that they weren't, yes?
Yes.
Can you recall, was that not clear to ICL before the contract was awarded to ICL Pathway?
With the benefit of hindsight, it should have been, but it was, I don't recall it ever being a material factor. And my recollection may be poor, but I do not recall it being a material factor. When one stops and thinks back to what happened, and even at the time when we got through at that stage the challenging period, with hindsight at that time, it seemed, how come we didn't anticipate that problem? Continuing to be completely factual and honest, as I will be throughout this.
Can we look at a couple of documents then? To start with, some board minutes from ICL Pathway. Fujitsu FUJ 0007 7832. Can we see the subject here is Pathway Group Board Meeting, and they're the minutes for the 3rd of October 1995. And we can see that you're in the distribution list,
Yep.
5 or 6 down at the top, yes?
Correct.
And can we turn forward to page 8 of the document, please? And look at paragraph 2. And just scroll down, please. Under the heading Timescales. And then it's about 5 lines from the bottom of paragraph 2, beginning the sentence also. Also, the quote, memorandum of understanding between BA Benefits Agency and POCL, Post Office Counters Limited, is causing trouble in taking forward. In short, something has to give. Either a new, faster procurement with a tighter focus on private finance initiatives, or a cleaner separation between what BA and POCL want.
Can you remind me of the date of this meeting? Sorry, I know you did.
October 1995. So this is 6 months before the award of the contract. And I think you've anticipated my question. Does this not suggest that it was obvious before the award of the contract that the two clients maybe had different objectives and priorities?
They were clearly having difficulty getting their memorandum. As I recall, I think they did. I think they did sign.
They did?
They did sign a memorandum of agreement. So at the time we bid, we would have believed they were aligned. As I've said earlier, with hindsight, perhaps we probably did misjudge that a document bringing people together would actually change, and I hesitate to say this word, sort of embedded cultural factors or long-standing challenges.
Can we turn forwards in the same document, please, to page 10? We can see that this is a memo from Tony Oppenheim to the Pathway Board. And so this is a memo submitted to the board in advance of the 3rd of October meeting, yes? Mm-hmm. Just to help you, that the way these papers are collected are that there's the covering memo that we saw, then there are the minutes, and then there are essentially the backing papers that appear to have been submitted to the meeting and tabled essentially at the meeting.
Yeah, and the evidence that you've shared with me, demonstrates the extensiveness of the documentation that was provided at the time.
To the board. And so this is Mr. Oppenheim's essentially report to the this board meeting. Just tell us, we're going to hear from him tomorrow, who Mr. Oppenheim was.
He was the commercial finance individual on the Pathway team.
So a director of ICL Pathway.
I believe so.
And he sets out his report with the good and the not so good. And can I just look at the not so good at the foot of the page? And can you see the second and third asterisk points? Serious timescale slippage pending, not yet declared. I'll come back to that in a moment. And then signs of dissent between Post Office Counters Limited and Benefits Agency. Will the joint procurement survive? Just a series of questions from this. Again, looking at what we saw on page 8 and now on page 10, was it not clear to ICL Pathway months before the contract was awarded, this is 6 months before the contract was awarded, that the two clients had different objectives and priorities, rather than something that only emerged after the contract was awarded?
Well, as I've said, with hindsight, our judgment could have been different. But at the time when we took the contract, we believed that the parties were aligned, that they had, and I forget the precise name of it, a memorandum of understanding, that the contract was clear, that it was a PFI, and that there was a series of service deliveries. What we then did not expect was that the parties would not, in our opinion, operate it as a PFI. They wanted to be involved in nearly every decision. We also experience delays in getting agreements where agreements would be preferable to us proceeding unilaterally.
You'll see that Mr. Oppenheim, after the question, will the joint procurement survive, has written risk or opportunity. I can understand, I think, that the joint procurement failing would amount to a risk to ICL Pathway. It would lose potentially millions of pounds, either in costs already incurred or loss of profitability in the future.
We had committed to this proposal with a total commitment. The timescales we touched briefly on, and I'm sure will come up again, were always tight. We couldn't wait for this delayed procurement to occur. We had to start to bring some of our team together. And to your question, yes, we were incurring significant costs because we believed that we had the most compelling bid to win the project, and wanted to be able to to use the phrase, get off the ground quickly once we had won the business. So yes, there was risk. If the procurement never happened, we would have had significant cost.
Sunk costs.
Sunk costs, thank you, yeah.
What I can't see at the moment is why the procurement failing would be an opportunity for ICL Pathway. Can you assist on that?
I'd be speculating. I don't have any recollection. And as you said, and as I understand it, you're speaking to Tony tomorrow. He might have a recollection. By the way, I have not spoken to Tony since I left ICL, not because we weren't on good terms, but in appropriate consistency with the requirements of this inquiry. I've not spoken to anybody about this project.
Can I get your understanding of what the opportunity might be to ICL if the procurement failed?
Well, Paul, I am attempting to answer your question, but I just want to make the point that we made very clearly in our position paper, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a moment, and the outcome, the final outcome, that actually if there is only one customer, the post office, it would be a lot cleaner and simpler. And at the time when, and I'm probably out of sequence of where your question is at the moment, at the time when that occurred, that DSS withdrew and it became the post, or only the post office. In my view, that was a lot simpler, and therefore the opportunity to work effectively with the post office would be a lot simpler. That's the only thing. Going back to your question, what does it mean? That it maybe relates to that one customer would be easier to work with.
I understand. Can we turn up, please, witness 03880100? That's the witness statement again, please, at page 25. And 25, please. And can we just look at paragraph 72 at the top, please? You say, I acknowledge that Pathway must take responsibility for entering into a contract with two distinct customers. With the benefit of hindsight, we should not have done this. We did not fully anticipate the diverging priorities of what we thought were two aligned government entities. Although we entered into the contract in good faith, it created complexities that we did not expect, albeit we could perhaps we could have had greater foresight as to the potential issues that could arise. You're, in this paragraph, are making some partial admissions or partial concessions there, but making them conditional on the application of hindsight, right?
Yes, and to the point you've raised up earlier, that it was my recollection at the time when we submitted the bid and at the time we signed the contract, we felt there was sufficient alignment. What this is saying, and what I referred to earlier, that with the benefit of hindsight, it was clear that we had made a mistake.
You say that you could have had greater foresight as to the potential issues that could arise. We've looked at a series of entries in the board minutes and a submission to the board 6 months before, where the divergence between the customer's objectives is made relatively clear, isn't it? We just looked at the board minutes
But I think
from October
we also
95.
acknowledged that there was subsequently an agreement between the parties, the DSS and Post Office, which would have addressed those concerns at the time we bid.
So are you saying that the memorandum of understanding between the two gave you comfort?
I don't recall specifically ever seeing the memorandum of understanding. What I'm putting to you is that in the context of the conversations that would have been had around the board at the time we submitted the final bid, we would have been concluding that we'd understood the requirements, we understood our solution, and we understood how we were going to deliver it.
What impact did the, speaking in very general terms to start with, did the agreement between two entities, Post Office and the Benefits Agency, in a tripartite agreement, and then the withdrawal of one of those entities, benefits agencies, from it, have on the delivery of the contract that was agreed between ICL and Post Office Counters Limited, i.e. the fact that this started as a three-way agreement and you were readying yourselves for that, and it turned into a two-way agreement with a different objective?
Well, in the period up to the withdrawal of the DSS, there was, from my recollection, an incredible. You're speaking to John Bennett, I believe, and you're speaking to Tony Oppenheim, and you're speaking to others from the group. There was a huge amount of time, distracting time, dealing with some of the aspects of the Department of Social Security. Again, this may come up later in your questioning, but the CAPS project and the delay, in our opinion on that, we were expecting a single interface from CAPS, and in the end, before they withdrew, there was to be a series of releases of CAPS. Now, I'll go back to I'll go back to your question in a moment, but I wanted to provide this piece of context. Again, you may pick this up later on. There are two consequences of the CAPS delays, three actually. One, just the time in the discussion distracted from the program. Two, the additional cost incurred. If you have one release of an API, a feed, you have one set of integration and testing to do. If you have multiple releases, you have to keep repeating that all the time. So it's much more costly to get it in multiple stages. But the third is, remember, this was a PFI contract. So the delay in having benefits coming out, pension benefits, one comes to mind, by, I think, over a year, but the actual dates are in my material, so they can be seen, results in lower income under a PFI.
Because, just to make it clear for anyone that's listening, under that arrangement, we'll come to look at the arrangement subsequently with Post Office Counters. Speaking in broad terms, ICL Pathway was paid in pence per transaction, and the
On the
tap
types of
wouldn't be turned on until the transaction
started flowing. So as the transactions were delayed further, the ability to, we were frustrated from our ability to be able to earn income. But if I then go back to what I recall your question was, at the point of withdrawal, it did not have a fundamental change to the core system which was being deployed in the post office for infrastructure. It was going to be a different way of handling the payments to beneficiaries. So it didn't have a fundamental impact at that particular point.
Any other effects on having negotiated and started to work towards the delivery of a system with two customers with different unaligned objectives, and then changing to just having Pockle as the contracting partner? You said that it didn't have any fundamental effect on the technology. Any other effects?
Well, it simplified the management processes.
So it was a positive effect.
At the separation, it was a positive effect. And that, in the end, at that particular point, was a factor that I do recall as the reason why ICL Pathway, ICL Fujitsu took the loss as part of the settlement agreement.
And so at the moment, only positive effects from the change in contractual position and change in the nature of the service that was being offered by ICL.
Yes.
So essentially what we're talking about now is simply interesting background, is that right? To the contract that was eventually agreed, a more straightforward design and build contract.
Yeah. Again, you may be going to bring some further factors out in this conversation, but at the point which that took place, which was, I recall, in 99.
Yes. May 99.
May 99, I think, a short period of agreement. At that point, it moved from PFI to a more standard design, build, and operate contract.
Had the fact that there had been 5 years, essentially, between August 94, the Secretary of State's announcement, and reaching that point, agreeing in May 99, the more straightforward design and build contract between Pockle and ICL, did that have any impact, i.e. there had been a 5-year delay on the timescales that were then agreed to by ICL for the delivery under the design and build contract?
I don't recall any.
In terms of timelines for delivery of the agreement under the tripartite agreement, can we just go back to the passage from your witness statement we were looking at in paragraph 39? This is page 11 of the document we've got on the screen. Thank you. It's 5 lines from the bottom, 6 lines from the bottom. By the time the bid was submitted, we're talking about here the original bid, we felt we had a sufficiently clear understanding of the requirements as defined at that time. It was a complicated process with a variety of players, but we felt that Pathway could deliver the project successfully. And then this, albeit on an extended timeline to that which was proposed by Pockle and DSS, this was, over the page, reinforced by the virtue of the fact that when Pathway was awarded the contract based on its re-tender document in April 96, the new invitation to tender had adopted the Pathway timetable for the project. So it's right, isn't it, that at this time, there wasn't any question of Pathway being forced at the outset of the contract to deliver to an unrealistic timetable set by the sponsors. It was Pathway's timetable that had been adopted.
Yeah, as I said earlier on, I would have had no specific recall of this. The documentation that I reviewed drew these dates and factors together, but certainly that is what the documentation would suggest, and that's why I put it forward in my statement.
So it was Pathway's own timetable that led the way.
That is what my statement says. It was, at the end of the day, the timetable that we had responded to. As I said in my statement, that there was some concern about not complying with the required timescale, because if other parties had done at an attractive price, we may have lost. But the documentation that exists, that is better recall, frankly, and long better than my memory, would suggest that actually the timetable that we bid and was accepted was initiated by us.
Thank you. So might that be an appropriate moment for the morning break?
Certainly. How long do you suggest, Mr. Beer?
15 minutes from now, sir? Which would make,
And what's the time now by you, so that I can...
I've got two different times. I've got either 25 past 11.
All right, 20 to 12. And Mr. Todd, I know you're alive to this point, but there's likely to be a number of breaks in your evidence. So talk about anything except your evidence, all right?
Yep, no, understand that fully. Thank you, sir.
Thanks.
Thanks, sir. So are you able to see and hear me now?
I can, yes.
We're just waiting for Mr. Todd to be brought back into the inquiry room.
That's fine.
And Mr. Todd, moving the chronology on a little bit, in November 1997, the DSS and Post Office Counters Limited served on ICL Pathway a formal notice of breach of contract. That's right.
Correct.
And cutting through it, your company denied such a breach and indeed served a reply that said, far from it being in breach of contract, the programme was now no longer commercially viable for you, and that to compensate ICL Pathway, it required a 30% price increase or a 5% price increase and a 5-year extension on the contract term. Do you remember?
I'm reminded by, so I remember the principle, yes,
Yes.
but the detail from the documents provided. And I think it's even clear from documents that have been shared that the DSS did that to, quote, protect their position.
What do you mean they did it to protect their position?
Serve notice of breach of contract.
What do you mean by they did it to protect their position, though? Rather than believing that you were in material breach of contract?
So I'm not a lawyer, but have been around contracts for a long time. It is a legitimate practice, and we, ICL Pathway, could have filed earlier breach of contract because, and through this period of the challenges we faced, we were continually challenged with when do we call time on what was a very difficult period of time. We chose not to file for breach at that time, and did subsequently submit our position paper to make clear to all parties, so there was no ambiguity of what our view was. But we were diligently trying to work forward on the project to transform the post office infrastructure and move the project forward. It was DSS's right to, at any time, submit the breach of contract, as it would have been for us.
In general terms, can you assist the chairman as to how it had come to this, that in May '96, Pathway had been awarded the contract, and in November 1997, both sides were alleging material breaches against the other?
As a result of a number of things which we have touched on already, the difficulty in implementing the contract we signed, which was under a PFI, what, in our opinion, was delay in decision-making around some aspects where we were trying to be cooperative with the parties. And as mentioned before, the delay in the DSS case of the CAPS program. In relation to the post office, as made clear in my position paper, and I believe I refer to it in my statement, it became clear through the early phase of the initial pilot, the initial go-live in the post office and the subsequent work, that there was a reasonably significant number of the post offices which were not fit for purpose for deploying modern technology.
You mean physically?
Physically, which had not been clear earlier. So to the chair, there were a number of issues which I would have expected that we would have been able to resolve without it ever getting to the point of dispute and breach, but we were not. And my next point is clearly opinion. I think what we found we were caught in, my words, was a dilemma where the post office was not excessively funded, and its ability to take a appropriate, in my opinion, pragmatic commercial decision on adjustments to the contract was challenged because of the ability to pay. I think we were also, and again, I accept this is opinion, challenged by the executive branch of government not being prepared to, in our opinion, acknowledge their responsibilities. And again, you may wish to take this on later on. One of the reasons why, and it will be clear to all, we felt in the end we had to escalate it further to include political involvement is in order to get, in our opinion, a fair and reasonable judgment on defining a way forward. So there were a lot of factors that were frustrating the project that resulted in those delays, Chair.
In the answers that you've just given, in your witness statement and in your position paper, you blame the Benefits Agency and Post Office Counters Limited and do not accept any responsibility by ICL for reaching this position. Is that right?
No, I don't think that is fair. We were rightly pointing out where we think that they the customers had frustrated this contract. As I've acknowledged earlier on, we certainly did some things wrong, and as well reported in, I think, in some of the documentation that John Bennett acknowledged, that there are certainly some things that the company did wrong.
The thing that you've so far referred to as the company doing wrong is not realising sufficiently in advance how unaligned the objectives of Post Office and the Benefits Agency were. Is there anything more than that in not realising how the customer's objectives differed that you, on behalf of ICL looking back?
Well, it's very difficult, and I am generally not trying to be evasive on this, but I don't recall specifics, but it would be inappropriate for me to sit here and say that there were no aspects of the project that we couldn't have done better. I do refer to resources. I believe that the resources were being made available. The involvement not just of the pathway team, but the access to other resources in ICL was there. Did take some delay sometimes to get resources up to speed, so that might be an example of where had we resourced more heavily earlier in anticipation of problems, some of the challenges of the projects may have been better addressed.
Can we turn up, please, the document that you've referred to, your position paper?
Yep.
It's poll 303 17. Thank you. And I just want to see what we've got here first in this little clip surrounding the position paper. The first page of this PDF is a copy of a letter sent from you to Stuart Sweetman, who was by then the MD of Post Office Counters Limited. And you say, following John Bennett's conversation with Paul Rich, I'm enclosing a courtesy copy of the letter and position paper that I've sent to Peter Matheson, who was the Chief Executive of the Benefits Agency. Yes?
Yep. Yes.
And that's dated the 10th of March. And then
Yep.
if we go over the page, please, we can see a copy of that letter.
Yep.
And you say to Mr. Matheson, Dear Peter, I now enclose on a without prejudice basis a position paper which sets out ICL's view in relation to the Pathway project. May I suggest that we arrange a further without prejudice meeting after you've considered the enclosed document so that we may continue to seek a way forward in this matter. And we can see the letter at the top was itself headed without prejudice. If we just scroll up.
Yep.
What was this sent without prejudice to? Without prejudice to what?
To our legal contractual rights. As I said earlier on, a few minutes ago, the approach that I was taking, ICL Pass with taking, ICL and Fujitsu were taking, was to find a constructive way forward to make this project successful. Despite the challenges we felt we were facing that we discussed earlier on. In the event we were unable to find a way forward in form of a compromise, which did subsequently happen, as you pointed out, in May 99, confirmed in, I think, July 99, we may have been forced to take legal action. It would have been very much the last resort.
So it was without prejudice because the position paper sought to find a constructive way forwards rather than relying on strict legal entitlements. Is that right?
But it was also attempting to do, so yes to your question, but an important point about the paper, which I think I do refer to in my statement. the number of stakeholders in this conversation was significant, not just in terms of the post office and the DSS, but the wider government organisation. And I do recall a time discussing with my colleagues that I was concerned that Chinese whispers may be occurring, that briefings were getting miscommunicated, and that the antidote to that was to try and write what I believe still is a clear paper outlining the position that we saw through the eyes of ICL Pathway and ICL.
Can we go over the page, please, to the position paper? And did you write this?
I was participant to writing it. At the time, a number of individuals were involved, working obviously with the Pathway team, John Bennett, almost certainly Tony Oppenheim, but Richard Christou, who was at the time commercial and legal head, and was my sort of right hand on commercial and legal matters, as well as reviewing it with Fujitsu. So there were a number of people, but that were parties to the preparation of this paper.
You introduce it by saying the purpose of the summary is to inform the Benefits Agency and Post Office Counters Limited of Pathway's position in relation to the Pathway project in order to facilitate proper commercial discussions to resolve the present problems and differences facing the parties on the project. The key issues have been summarised under headings, and I think we see 8 of those in due course, with the aim of providing an overview of the problems which Pathway has experienced in performing the project in the context of a PFI contract. I just want to look at some of the headings. Overall, and you've obviously looked at this more recently, do you actually in the paper suggest any constructive ways forwards, or do you just set out the problems?
We set out the problems. You had mentioned previously, I think prior to this paper, we had made a commercial proposal. I believe it was, from recollection, it was before, but I can't guarantee that. And it was clear, if I go back to what I referred to a few moments ago, that it was almost structurally verging on possible for the Post Office and the DSS executives to agree to a commercial solution. It was my recollection of our view at the time that we needed to escalate it, as I said a moment ago, to have, in my opinion, transparency on what the underlying issues were as we saw them. At the end of the day, where the other parties, and they probably didn't agree with our view of it, without going through the court process, a conclusion of these difficulties was arrived at, as we've said, in the May 99 time to July 99 timeframe, both commercially and from a project point of view.
Can we look at the first heading, PFI principles, further down the page, please? And in this and the next paragraph, you set out, essentially, is this right, the theory of a PFI contract in advance of the remainder of your points, which explain why these principles were, in your view, undermined by the conduct, actions, omissions, and decision-making of the DSS and POCL. Is that right? This is a statement of
Yes.
the theory of a PFI contract.
Yeah, where substantial control to deliver the service is handed over to the supply side, and control of the design and implementation is not with the customer.
And so you say in the third line, the supplier, that's ICL, takes the entire risk of providing a solution to meet the business requirements of the sponsor, but in turn, the supplier is given the overall freedom to determine the solution to be provided. It is therefore fundamental that, having transferred the initial risk associated with the implementation phase of a project, the supplier should not be hindered during this phase by the sponsor. It's for the supplier to manage the technical aspects of the project in an expeditious time frame, so that the supplier is capable of earning revenue which is commensurate with the risks of the project. And then over the page, please, second paragraph, it follows from this overriding principle that the sponsor has the right to monitor the work and the right to reject the IT solution following acceptance testing if the solution is unable to meet the acceptance criteria. However, the acceptance criteria can only be based on the sponsor's business requirements. In other words, having defined the requirements to be met by the system, it's not then for the sponsor to dictate the solution, which must remain the exclusive responsibility of the supplier. And so what you were saying here was that the solution to the requirements that the customer had set out were the exclusive preserve of you, ICL. You got to be trusted. You took the risk on of delivering those, and it wasn't for the benefits agency or POCL to interfere.
Yeah, I'm not wishing to be pedantic, but ICL Pathway, which was a wholly owned subsidiary at this time of,
yes.
Of ICL. But yes, that is correct. And what we had seen through the period of this, from the early days, was a desire from the customers. My recollection says specifically the DSS, but I would not exclude the post office, to be involved in every decision, which was challenging.
You say in the next paragraph, the problems which Pathway has faced and continues to face on the project arise from the fact that the authorities, that's both BA and POCL, have breached these basic PFI principles. Moreover, the benefits agency has compounded the situation by separately misrepresenting the true position. So that they were making false statements, is that right, the benefits agency?
It certainly, from my recollection of what was going on at the time, it felt that there was a greater knowledge that the CAPS program timescales I referred to earlier were changing. We never got to the bottom of any conclusion or any insights to be able to prove that one way or another, other than what is attached to this document, which is the schedule of the time frame for the rollout of the benefits, how it changed from when the RFQ came out to the sort of final position before DSS withdrew.
You said that you never got to the bottom of it. You were certainly, by this stage, sufficiently sure of yourselves to allege against the government department misrepresentation.
I'm not a lawyer. That was our opinion at the time. That document, was not a formal breach document. It was our view about the position being misrepresented.
You don't throw allegations like that around just because they're written under cover of a without prejudice letter, do you? You must have some evidence to back them up.
Well, the schedule at the back.
So it's true then that you did have evidence of misrepresentation by the benefits agency on the progress and timelines of the CAPS delivery programme.
The fact we've attached to this document a schedule of when the delivery existed or was going to be compared to the RFP is evidence that the timescales slipped.
That's not evidence of misrepresentation, is it?
That's true.
So why was the allegation of misrepresentation made?
No, I don't recall.
Can we turn to, if we just scroll through the document to look at the headings. The next is design interference and enhance requirements. And then over the page to the authorities and the program delivery authority. Yes?
Yeah.
And then over the page, please. Back a page, please. Just under that, just picking up some points, at the foot of the page there, you say the contractual program was based upon an aggressive implementation timetable. Just stopping there, that's the timetable that Pathway had proposed, yes?
It had proposed it in response to our understanding of the times that the customers would want for the rollout of the infrastructure.
What does aggressive mean in this context?
I don't recall.
So I think we'd established earlier that ICL was the author of the aggressive timetable. Is that right?
The timetable which ICL Pathway put into the proposal was in response to the RFQ, which was later than, as I understand it from the documentation, the RFQ, the request for proposal, had asked for. And so therefore, yes, it was our proposed timetable.
And in this sentence, you say that this was done partly to achieve fast business returns for the parties. Does that mean in part so that ICL can start to earn money by reference to the volume of transactions undertaken using the system?
Well, again, I just need to, this is a complicated topic because there's a lot of things going on at this time. Again, from my recollection of the situation, there was a lot of challenges in the post office, the need for modernisation of the infrastructure, and the original time frame in the RFP had been aggressive because the post office wanted to roll out new technologies quickly. So we were conscious that the post office wanted to be able to get the benefits of a new infrastructure. It was going to be the basis on which new services could be provided for their business. It was also important, as I recall, understanding the DSS wanted to, address the fraud challenges. So
and there was a saving to be made there.
Yeah, and so therefore, my answer to your question is it was in the interest of all three parties to have as shorter timetable as possible. The benefits for all parties were important, and therefore a short time frame. It was also, to link back to something I touched on earlier, we had the opportunity going back well before the date of this position paper to stop work. And I do recall some conversation about that. Do we just stop and reset? The view we took was what I believe to be the right one, which was a constructive one, which was to focus on the project, get the initial go live working, and that did occur, as I recall, as required, and although it being limited was, quote, successful.
Successful in what sense?
Well, as I'm rereading the reports, that it had met the requirements for, at that time, I think it was just child benefit, one benefit, and a limited set of post offices to be rolled out. So going back to your question on the time frame, it was in all parties' interest to get this infrastructure in as soon as possible.
and from ICL's perspective, which is the question I asked, in order that it could start earning revenue?
Including that.
There's a reference here that the programme was based on an aggressive timetable, partly for political reasons. What were the political reasons that there was an aggressive timetable?
I don't specifically recall. I believe it was related to what I touched on a moment ago about the importance of improving the post office footprint and reducing the number of closures of post offices, but I'm afraid I can't recall specifically.
And was that a political reason as you saw it?
I'm just suggesting it was a political pressure. And certainly, as I think about it here, yeah, I mean, it has, being most of my life lived in the UK, not all my life, but yeah, it's been a pressure that I would have understood to be there, to have a vibrant post office. Without being out at a tangent, you know, I use it regularly, and it's a great service in the community.
Can we go forward to page 11, please?
Yeah.
Which is under the heading caps. And can we look at the bottom paragraph on the page, please? You say CAPS is so fundamental to the viability of the project programme that had Pathway known the true position, it's doubtful whether Pathway would have entered into the contract. At the very least, Pathway would have priced the services to reflect the deferred CAPS programme and revenue loss. Following award of the contract, if Pathway had been told of the delay to the CAPS programme, Pathway would have had the opportunity and time to mitigate the impact of such delay and respond commercially to the changing circumstances of the project. Pathway would have been relieved of the coercive effect of the aggressive timetable, which drove Pathway to minimise delay and absorb additional costs without proper recourse to the procedures laid down in the contract. What was the amount of losses or absorbed losses that you're referring to there?
I don't recall the specific number.
You can't remember now how much money Pathway lost as a result of the delay that you attribute to CAPS?
Specifically related to CAPS, no, I don't recall.
You say in the second line from the bottom, Pathway would have been relieved of the coercive effect of the aggressive timetable. What was the coercive effect that you refer to there?
It must be referring to the timetable that we anticipated that we anticipated we needed to deliver to meet the requirements for the Department of Social Security's part of the contract.
In your statement, no need to turn it up, at paragraph 83, which is page 29 of your statement, you refer to ICL Pathway facing, quote, revenue losses and increased costs, which run into hundreds of millions of pounds.
Yes.
Can you recall how many hundreds of millions of pounds you were there referring to?
Well, there were various calculations done, as I've been reminded by looking at documents. The Corbett analysis at one point, as I recall, had two numbers: a net present value number,
Yes.
which was 200 to 300 million, and the gross value of that, as I recall from seeing from recent documents, was put to my colleagues as sort of 500 million.
Your colleagues within ICL?
To ICL. I seem to recall from reviewing the documents recently. If I had not seen any of these documents, I would have been saying it was a very substantial, a few hundred million.
was the response to that within ICL to itself to tighten its belt, to try and reduce the spend on this contract, reduce staffing?
The only area where the documents have reminded me that we did was in relation to, I think, the rollout plan, because if there is not going to be a rollout plan to the same time frame, we need less people around the country to implement. So it would have been redundant cost on the implementation teams. I don't recall at all ever reductions in the core team that were responsible for delivering the service. As I've referred to previously, my recollection is that we had taken a line consistent with my and Fujitsu's philosophy that we wanted to succeed in this project, and that we had invested significant sums of money, and we wanted this to be a national success for the customers and ourselves. So, we were, fully vested and fully committed, and, the support, as the documentation shows, from Fujitsu through and ICL, and frankly the team in Pathway that were dealing with these additional matters than just delivering the project, having to cope with the commercial discussions, the decisions on the project. The team in Pathway, I think, should. I may think I made a statement in my statement that they take great credit for how they continue to work under challenging conditions. But to go back to your question, there was no recollection of mine that says there was any wholesale cutting back of costs. It was only where the costs would have been redundant.
Does that represent your view overall, that for ICL and for ICL Pathway Limited, it should take great credit for the delivery of Horizon?
No, didn't say that.
No. And why is that not your view, that it should take great credit for the delivery of Horizon?
We were delivering a project which we knew internally as Pathway, which was the technology infrastructure. As we've discussed today, there were some great challenges through the early stages of this project. The initial go-live substantially happened, as I recall, on time. Subsequent challenges put delays into the project. There is no doubt with what happened and the events that led in subsequent years, it is there's sort of no way that any party can feel comfortable at being involved in any element of this project.
Can we turn back to the position paper insofar as it deals with Post Office Counters Limited, and that's in a section on page 10 of this document. And as you rightly said in answers a moment ago, it was to do with the premises infrastructure that you made allegations against Post Office.
Yeah.
And it's at the foot of the page, please, under the heading POCL. And it's just in this paragraph. Is one paragraph that relates to the Post Office. If we can just read this first. It became apparent during installation work for the first 200 post offices, and just stopping there, that's part of the initial go-live. It was 1, then 10 in Stroud, and then rolled out to, I think, 201 or 202.
Yeah, the initial go-live, I think, was, the initial 10, and the subsequent phases were those up to 200, yeah.
The first 200 post offices, that many post offices are not fit for the purpose of installing automation equipment. Post Office Counters Limited could not reasonably have believed that the post office premises were fit for automation and did not give Pathway a proper opportunity to investigate the physical condition of the Post Office Counters Limited premises for itself before entering into the contract. If the extent of the work required to render Post Office Counters Limited premises fit for installation of automation equipment had been made known at the pre-contract stage, Pathway would have adjusted its bid price accordingly and allowed more time for this work in planning. Indeed, the full impact of this problem is still being assessed. Of greatest concern are the substantial additional costs and the possibility that the problem is so severe that it will not be possible to maintain the required beat rate during national rollout. Indeed, it would appear to be impossible to automate all post offices in their current role. Just picking up on a phrase there, beat rate during national rollout, that was a number of post offices automated live per week.
Yeah, and as I recall, reminded by the documents, that I think when I left, it was getting up to 300. So there was a rollout plan that increased the number of post offices that would be upgraded. The exact phasing of that, I don't recall.
At this stage, we're still dealing with a PFI contract, yes?
We are.
Yes.
Thank you.
And you say that it became apparent during installation work for the first 200 that many post offices are not fit for the purpose. Isn't that the risk that the supplier takes on rather than for the client under a PFI deal at the time that you were then operating? The client doesn't have the responsibility of assessing their own premises' readiness and fitness and suitability for automation. They simply make a requirement how post offices need to be automated. And then, as you say, it's up to you as the supplier to ensure that that happens.
That would be, in our view, unreasonable. And no, I would disagree with you.
Why?
Because we would have been given some indication. I say we. I was not directly involved. Just to, remind you, this was a very important contract in the whole of ICL. So the team would have had some exposure to what a post office looked like, and based on the sample of what we would have seen, a view would have been taken on the rollout. What we're saying here was, it subsequently turned out that whatever we saw during the bidding phase or the early phase, the actual quality of the estate was significantly worse than expected.
But I'm drawing you back to what you said at the outset of this position paper, which said that it's not for the client to make arrangements for or to specify.
But there would always.
Hold on, I haven't finished the question.
Sorry.
How the premises are to be automated. They settle a requirement that they are to be automated, and then it's down to you, the supplier, to make sufficient investigations to work out how that is to be done and how much it's going to cost. No?
I would disagree that there would be an assumption of a basic adequacy based on what had been represented at the time. But I had no participation in the direct conversations that made those assessments.
Before this contract with the post office, ICL had no experience with working with the post office whatsoever, had it?
That's my recollection.
You confirmed that in paragraph 25.
Yeah, that was my recollection.
Did they keep you locked out of post offices? Did they prevent you from going in, or the company from going into post offices to assess their fitness for physically for automation?
No, that would not be the case.
Did ICL ask for access to post offices?
I have no specific recollection. I believe that there had been an assessment of the post offices which we had access to, which was the basis on which we had made an assumption. But you may get more clarity when my colleagues who are dealing with this day by day appear before this inquiry.
Before the contract, can you help us with what ICL Pathway did itself to find out what the state and standards were like within post office branches?
Afraid at this time I can't recall. This is now 27 years ago.
Yes. Can you therefore not recall what opportunity there had been for ICL to investigate the physical condition of post office premises?
I can't recall anything specific. My judgment is that we would have had some access. For example, the initial 10, we must have known where they were because of the very early delivery date for the go live of those initial 10.
But that's post contract.
Yeah.
The go live. We're talking that the criticism here is that you wouldn't have signed up to the contract if you'd known the state of the branches. So it's no good pointing to the go live phase and say, well, we discovered things then. What you're saying here is that you didn't know the physical condition of the post office estate before entering into the contract, aren't you?
I'm saying, this document is saying, our position was that we had a different understanding of the state of the post office estate. I'm afraid I can't help you with specifics on what that was based on. One, because it was 27 years ago, and two, I didn't personally inspect the
Of course, and I'm not suggesting that you did. Would you accept that Pathway had been contracted to build an end-to-end automated and operational accounting system for the post office network, and that it was down to Pathway to check that the post office branches could support such a system before it contracted?
The answer to the question you're posing has a big dependency, and that is that we would have had to make an assessment, not by pre-bid, to your own point, pre-bid, go and visit 20,000 post offices to inspect their estate. I think that would have been unreasonable for any bidder, for any contract to do. What is likely to have been done, now I cannot attest to whether it was represented by the post office or it was our assessment of the ones we saw. There would have been a view taken about the suitability of the post offices for the deployment of this technology. Quite clearly, the team that were working every day, and I believe some of the documents that were put in front of me more recently, so acknowledge the challenges that my team found in looking at some of the post office estate. I don't believe the lack of fitness for deployment of technology was challenged by the post office, but maybe my recollection is incorrect.
Given that this was the late 1990s, what did ICL Pathway expect of branch post offices, some of them likely to have been in operation for 100 years or more using paper-based systems?
I've never thought about the question as you posed.
Well, you say in this document that the post office did not give Pathway a proper opportunity. Was that proper opportunity asked for and denied to Pathway?
I don't recall the specific answer to that. I repeat what I said earlier on, that I had a full-time team here, some of whom you're going to be interviewing, that were focused on this on a day-to-day basis.
Would you accept that with an estate of, say, 20,000 post offices, the reasonable thing to do would be to inspect a sample of them and then draft a minimum condition guarantee?
As you say that is rational and reasonable.
Was that done?
Don't recall.
What was the minimum standard of condition that Pathway expected?
Again, my detailed knowledge, recollection of 27 years ago would not be able to give you a sufficient answer.
Maybe if I can jog your memory, would it be that in order to support the hardware to be installed within the premises, at least
It need counter space and power, yes. This is
well, hold on,
yeah.
a telephone line that was connected to the BT service?
Okay, I would not have recalled that.
Can you recall whether there was an understanding that the telephone line connection from post office branches would be a copper line, i.e. an ordinary telephone line, connecting into the BT network?
I don't recall that.
Can you remember now discussion over whether such copper telephone lines were subject to interference from other devices or inclement weather or degradation over time, and that could affect the quality of the signal being transmitted across the system?
I have no recollection of any conversation at the time about the quality of the copper lines into post offices.
If we just look at paragraph 74 of your witness statement, please, which is witness 03380100 at page 25. Page 25, thank you. Under the heading Post Office Infrastructure, you say at 73, there were significant issues with the Post Office's own infrastructure. During installation work, it became clear that many Post Office premises were not fit for hardware installation. And the DSS and POCL did not factor this into the time frame for completion of the project. I'll just ask again, wasn't it your responsibility to establish whether the premises were fit for hardware installation as part of your due diligence, if you like, before entering into the contract?
I would say clearly, based on what we wrote at the time in this position paper, and we would have had access to other documentation and current knowledge, we did not believe that was the case.
In paragraph 75, if we just scroll down, you set out the position, as you say clearly in the position paper that we have read, and then just go back up to 74, please. You say in the December 97 monthly report, these issues were highlighted as, quote, critical to resolve, that report noted, quote, the difficulties with the post office estate regarding the, quote, poor physical condition of the vast majority of the post offices and, quote, the appetite to confront this head on or within Post Office Counters Limited has yet to be seen. And then by March 98, the monthly report stated that these issues had escalated into, quote, a major dispute. The total cost for putting their estate into a fit purpose for automation is on the wrong side of £40 million. Now, we know that national rollout began at least by the start of the year 2000, yes?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
How were the issues that were so critical being referred to here, putting the estate into a state that was fit for purpose for automation, resolved by the year 2000?
When the contract would have been re-baselined, which was between May and July 99, that matter must have been taken account of. I have no specific recollection of how it was taken account of, but to state the obvious, it was a known issue. It was in our position paper. A view would have had to have been taken at that time.
So breaking it down, was any work to your knowledge done by ICL between the position paper that we've been speaking about, which raised this issue of the fitness for the estate, the fitness of the estate, and the commencement of the contract in May 1999 to put the estate into a state fit for automation?
There was no work done by ICL Pathway to make the estate fit. I have no recollection of what further research was made. My recollection is that the post office team did not dispute that it needed to be upgraded. The issue was a commercial one as to...
Who was going to pay for it?
Yeah.
And can you recall who was going to pay for it and who was going to do the work?
It was our view, as put in position paper before the revised contract, that it should be the post office. At the time the contract was reset in, repeat these two dates, between May and July, I think it was signed in July, July 99, that matter must have been taken account of, but I cannot sit here and recall a decision. At the time that the Treasury sponsored, an individual, I think it was Steve Robson in the Treasury, sponsored a short period for the two parties, Post Office and ICL Pathway, to agree a new contract. Richard Christo and Tony Oppenheim, as I recall, and John Bennett were the primary parties discussing and negotiating it, and the fitness of the post office estate was known about. So my assumption is that we took full account of that in signing up to the new contract.
What would you say to the suggestion that come the new contract in July 99, this issue was overlooked and that national rollout commenced in the year 2000 with the cracks having been papered over?
Surprise.
Looking at the position paper as a whole, taking a step back, would this be right, that the entirety of the fault in ICL Pathway's mind was that of the benefits agency and to a lesser extent the post office, and that ICL Pathway was entirely blameless?
I mentioned and said earlier, I think it would be inappropriate for us to say that we had no faults. Our position paper was a position paper to point out the things which we felt that these other stakeholders had not appropriately handled and that had affected our ability to deliver the contract.
Were there any admissions in this without prejudice letter of anything that ICL had done wrong or incorrectly?
I read it several times recently and I don't recall it. And
I don't think there are there?
No.
You suggested earlier that this position paper was supposed to be a constructive way forwards. Why were the errors and omissions and faults of ICL Pathway not also identified in this without prejudice letter?
I can only provide you with my view at this stage, as opposed to necessarily at the time. But we were dealing with a intense situation where from recollection, it felt that we were struggling to get, and this is well reported in some of the documents that's been shared from the government side, that I was getting frustrated by the intransigence, the inability to move anybody forward, whilst we continue to spend a lot of money in delivering this project. And therefore, a robust position was taken in our conversations, and this position paper set out not our faults, but the faults of the other stakeholders.
And that was the constructive way forwards, was it?
Well, what papers like this fail to take account of is any of the other conversations that were going on. But it was a statement of our concerns as to what had gone wrong from the other stakeholders.
Can we look at this from a different perspective, please? And have
Before you do that, Mr. Beer,
Yes.
could someone take the witness statement down from my screen, please?
I'm so sorry, sir. That should have been my request.
Right, thanks. Thank you.
Can we look at this from a different perspective and have on the screen Fujitsu FUJ 0007 7834, please? This is a report entitled Chief Executive's Report of May 97. It's dated the 7th of May 1997. And if we just skip forwards to page 5, please, and go to the foot of the page, we can see that it's authored by you.
Yep.
And just go back to page 1, please, so that you can orientate yourself in the nature of this document. There's an overview at the beginning, and then you set out in a number of headings the position in relation to issues such as politics, the market, competitors, the financial performance of ICL Pathway, and then some specific issues.
Of ICL, yeah.
Of ICL.
Yeah.
Can we look at Pathway specifically, which is on page 5? And this is the part of your report, and this goes to the board, presumably the ICL main board.
Correct.
Paragraph 7.5, you say, this is May 97, the latest release of the Pathway software has gone live, release 1B last Friday, on schedule. However, a significant amount of time was required to eliminate, quote, software bugs, which meant that resource that was working on release 1C and 1D due in July had to be diverted to resolving the software issues. This additional work has an adverse impact on the development costs. We've advised the customer that there could be a 6-week delay in the next release. The customer is appreciative of the open approach. Actions are in place to mitigate the consequence of delay, i.e. national rollout starting in January 98 rather than November 97. Although this delay is disappointing, we do not see any issues ahead of us that cannot be resolved. The relationship with the customer, DSS and Post Office, is good, but they are concerned about the potential delay. So this is May 97, and summarising this, what you're saying here is that there's been an initial live release that has led to the identification of some software bugs. That has diverted resources, and that you have therefore had to tell the customers that there's going to be a delay of 6 weeks. That was all down to ICL Pathway, wasn't it? All of those things that we mentioned.
Those words imply that.
Well, we've advised the customer, this is you telling the customer, or the company telling the customers, as to what has happened internally within ICL Pathway and the consequences on delivery of the project. So it's not something that they've done. You're not saying to the customers, you've done something wrong, this has, it's your fault. You have had an impact on the delivery timetable.
Yeah.
It's identification of issues that are the responsibility of ICL Pathway, isn't it?
it's a statement of fact that there's going to be a delay. It's reporting. It's not necessarily covering all of the things that were going on at that time.
Well, is there anything mentioned here that is anything to do other than with software bugs that there are a responsibility
there's no mention of
ICL
else.
Pathway?
No. And that is my monthly report. As we've talked about before, there were monthly reports which you've had extensive access to, which is good, going back through Pathway, and also ICL board reports that, as I recall, happened on a monthly basis. And I would provide a synopsis of the main factors during that as part of that report.
And at this time, in the May 97 CEO report, you were saying that relations between ICL Pathway and the customers were good. And so you were saying that they, the customers, were concerned about the potential delay caused by ICL problems at this point.
That's an interpretation of that.
But just read the 3 paragraphs again to yourself.
Yeah, no.
And I mean,
I'm not.
That is an interpretation of it. Suggests, Mr. Todd, that it's an unfair interpretation of it. Is it the correct interpretation of it, please?
So, not from recollection, from looking at this document, it is a fair representation of it.
We, ICL Pathway, have made some errors. We're still on in good relations with our 2 customers, despite the delay about which they are concerned. Fair summary?
Yeah, I stand by what is written in that document, because it would have been what we felt at that time. There may be other factors, but yeah, yes.
Would you have kept factors back from the board?
No.
Right. No. Can we go to the July 97?
No material factors, small factors, yeah. Can
we go to the July 97 report, please, which is FUJ 00077835. So you can see again, this is your report for July 97. And if we just go to the last page, which is page 7, at the foot of the page, we can see your name against it.
Yep.
And if we can just go, and there's a similar format with an overview at the beginning, an outline of the political situation, the market, competitors, other suppliers to you, the order book, and then individual projects. And we find the section concerning Pathway at page 6, please. And if we can just read that's the entirety of it there. You say, following the completion of the internal audit and the results of the early release 1C test, we have declared an 8-week slip. This in effect means that the 1C deliverable would be 15 weeks later than expected. The project issues are being addressed with strengthening of the program management. Just stopping there, that means within ICL Pathway.
Yes.
Technical support, that means within ICL Pathway, yes? Yes?
Yep.
And increase in the project resource to address the volume of test issues. And that means, again, within ICL Pathway.
Yes.
The reasons for the delay are rooted in the long delay in agreeing the delivery spec. Specifically, the security environment was not agreed until the end of April, and the multiple additional interfaces into the customer's system. There are clearly lessons to be learned from this project for future PFI projects, and these will be shared with the customer. The priority is to ensure the project implementation goes in effectively and the customer confidence is restored. I've briefed the head of DSS, Benefits Agency and Post Office counters personally with the project team in parallel with the project activity to deliver 1C in October and release 2 in March. We're assessing the implications on the overall programme with the customer. So here you were suggesting that there were lessons to be learned for ICL, is that right?
Certainly for ICL, but I would have thought for all, I was implying on all parties dealing with PFIs.
And were you suggesting that customer confidence needed to be restored? End of the 4th paragraph.
Yeah, I'm just looking. It says that.
So was the customer, i.e. Benefits Agency and POCL, were they suffering from a drop in confidence in ICL pathway at this point?
That's the implication of the statement.
And the delays here were, again, at least in significant part, due to ICL pathway, i.e. the 8-week slip referred to in the first paragraph. Is that right?
We don't get into the underlying causes of the slip. What I believe it is doing is declaring that it had occurred. And reading it in isolation, it does suggest what you said.
Yes. I mean, we heard evidence from Mr. Copping last week from PA Consulting, who said that the problems with Release 1 were significant and were a product of ICL's serious misjudgments. In neither of these reports, the May or the July 97 report, were you saying that the company needed to take a stand against the DSS or Post Office Counters Limited, i.e. pointing out any of the things that a little while later you were to observe in the position paper? Is that right?
As I've said on a couple of occasions, I think today, we were trying to focus on getting the project delivered and in parallel have discussions to resolve issues on the project, but also any of the commercial issues. As you referred to earlier, the situation was brought to a head by the submission of a breach letter to the company, which required us to produce or clarify and produce the position paper which we discussed a few minutes ago.
Can I understand that answer, that you went on the robust offensive by the position paper in 98 because of and as a result of a breach notice served on you? Is that right?
Well, I'm not familiar with these types of proceedings, and the risk of you putting words in my mouth.
I'm trying to understand your answer.
No, I accept that. I'm just trying to avoid adopting your words.
You explain it to me then. I'm looking at the moment at some internal reporting by you up to your board that doesn't identify any problems with the customers. It only identifies in the first document a problem with ICL Pathway's own performance. And then not long later, we have your position paper, which points the finger in 8 respects at your customers. And essentially, I'm asking, how did that come about?
Well, depends which part of what came about. The involvement of Fujitsu, ICL, Pathway, there was great transparency right the way through through the company at that time. Some of those issues that resulted in the position paper were definitely appearing. They've not been reflected in these reports that you're referring to.
Why was that? Why were they not being reported back to the ICL main board?
I don't specifically recall, but I do recall that all matters, including Fujitsu, were aware of the underlying issues, and you may get to it eventually. I think everybody from Fujitsu, ICL board down, the independent advisors believe that we had dealt with a very difficult situation dealing with two elements of government very professionally and very well through a very difficult time. And I provided some of that evidence in attached to my statement.
Can we, just before the break, turn to one last piece of evidence on this issue and look up poll 43645. Moving forwards to September 97, this is a record of the counter-automation steering group of that date, and we can see who's present from the post office.
Yeah.
Mr. Roberts, Mr. Cope, Mr. Close, Mr. Sweetman and Mr. Rich, and from ICL at you, Mr. Bennett and Mr. Coombs.
Yep.
And it records the action in terms of who spoke. Can we just look at what Mr. Roberts said, the purpose, i.e. of the meeting, I think. He needed, a clear picture from ICL on how they think the programme is going and their confidence in solving issues around delay, and secondly, assurance about the programme for the Post Office Board. And then you reported to have given your overview. Can we just read through what you're recorded as saying? Horizon is critically important to ICL and Fujitsu and to Post Office, and hoped it is for the DSS. His belief that the programme is doable and that ICL will commit all necessary funds to deliver its part. His view that his own macro objectives in setting out on the programming had not changed, i.e. to put the UK national infrastructure via post offices that could be developed long-term for society as part of a, quote, national information flow, and secondly, to take the first serious steps through using cards for DSS fraud control to take the, quote, information society to technology-resistant, quote, mass market, quote, in the country, and then build on that, e.g. via smart cards. He, that's you, has taken a calculated gamble that delivering Pathways programme will enable ICL to become the Post Office's main technology partner, that Horizon remains the best practicable option for DSS, and that Horizon is a world-class system, brackets, evidence of many postal administrations wanting it. Can I pick up a couple of points that you're referred to as raising there, or reported to have raised? What was the nature of the calculated gamble that you had undertaken? Who or what were you gambling with?
I don't recall those words at all.
Thinking back, can you remember what you might have been gambling with?
I wouldn't have been gambling with anything. I would be taking a view about a long-term relationship with the Post Office. The Post Office, with a modern infrastructure in the information society as it was known in those days, would have provided an opportunity for increased revenue for the Post Office as well as a subsequent ICL pathway.
You expressed the view that Horizon was a world-class system and that many postal administrations around the world wanted it, yes?
Yes, I did. Actually, I don't recall, to be accurate, I don't recall that I've read this in this document that I've before, but I certainly do recall that apart from what we've already referred to, that the Irish Post Office had adopted the system, we had seen a opportunity for many post offices around the world, don't recall all their locations, that we were seeing as a future business opportunity. So success on the this project would have been very beneficial to other opportunities in the post office marketplace.
And then just lastly, over the page, please, at paragraph 5. Mr. Roberts summarised as follows. First, the Post Office was very disappointed at the current situation. The Post Office and POCL is still keen to do this project and make it work. ICL's credibility is at stake, and confidence in pathway with the Post Office is still uncertain. And then over the page to paragraph 6. You're recorded as replying by saying you appreciated the spirit in which the meeting had been conducted, and reaffirmed ICL's commitment to make it work, and the meeting ended. Would you agree that a fair reading of these minutes is that these are the Post Office saying that they are disappointed in ICL's performance, that your credibility was at stake, rather than the other way round, you suggesting that it was fault within the Post Office that had led to the existing delays?
As we discussed earlier, my recollection is the significant challenge that we had related to the Post Office was the estate. The related item was the decision-making of which they were part, but much more significantly related to DSS than the Post Office, as I recall it.
Mr. Todd, thank you very much. That's an appropriate moment for a break for lunch, if it suits you.
Okay.
Yes, of course.
Thank you very much. Can we say 2 o'clock then, please?
Yes, of course, yeah. 2 o'clock, everyone.
Thank you.